The whole saloon laughed when Caleb Stone pushed his last chips into the center of the table. They laughed louder when he won. And they laughed hardest of all when he stood up and claimed the silent, dirt-covered woman as his prize. They called her worthless. They said Caleb had finally lost his mind. But by the time the first frost melted off his mountain field, those same men would whisper his name with something close to awe, because the woman they mocked would change everything. 3 days before that poker game, Caleb Stone had stood alone at the edge of his land and wondered if it was time to give up. 160 acres of Montana soil stretched before him like a stubborn enemy. Rocks broke through the surface. Wind bent the thin grass. The earth gave just enough to keep him alive, but never enough to let him breathe easy. Behind him stood the cabin he had built with his own hands. Strong walls, straight beams, a roof that did not leak. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt hollow. 7 years had passed since he buried Sarah and their newborn son under the cottonwood tree on the rise behind the house. 7 years since laughter had filled those walls. 7 years of eating alone, working alone, sleeping alone. Caleb was 45, but grief had carved deeper lines into his face than age ever could. Every Sunday he stood by those two graves, hat in hand, telling them about the week. The failed wheat, the dry well, the silence that followed him from room to room. He was not a man who liked town. But sometimes the quiet pressed so hard against his chest that he rode down the mountain just to hear other voices. That was how he ended up at the Silver Creek Saloon that Saturday night. The air inside was thick with smoke and noise. Boots thudded against wooden floors. Whiskey glasses clinked. Men argued about cattle prices and weather forecasts. Caleb stayed near the bar at first, nursing a drink, half listening. Then the crowd near the poker table shifted. Thomas Dalton sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. Owner of the largest ranch in the territory. Fine coat, silver threading through his dark hair. A man used to winning. Across from him sat a drifter named Garrett. Lean, hard eyes. The kind of man who carried trouble in his shadow. The pot between them was heavy with coins. Caleb tried to ignore it. Gambling had never been his weakness. Then Garrett said the words that turned the room cold. "I'm out of money," he muttered, "but I've got something worth more." Dalton raised an eyebrow. Garrett jerked his thumb toward the door. "I've got a woman." The room fell silent. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with interest. Garrett stepped outside and came back, dragging her by the arm. She stumbled into the lamplight. Thin, dress torn and smeared with dirt, dark hair tangled across her face, rope loose around her wrists. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stood there, eyes lowered, like she had already left the world in her mind. Laughter broke the silence. "She don't look worth much," someone said. Dalton studied her like livestock. Garrett defended his wager with a shrug. "She can work. She's quiet." Caleb felt something twist inside him. He had seen death. He had seen cruelty. He had seen men break under hardship. But something about the way she stood there, still and silent, stirred something old and stubborn in him. Dalton shook his head. "No need for her," he said. "Fold or match the pot." Garrett's eyes swept the room, desperate. "Anyone else want the hand?" No one moved. Every man in that room made the same calculation. Trouble, expense, burden. Caleb set his whiskey glass down. "I'll play." The laughter turned toward him. "Since when do you gamble, Stone?" Caleb did not answer. He sat across from Garrett. The cards were dealt. Caleb barely looked at his hand. He was thinking about Sarah, about the promise he once made to be a decent man no matter how hard life got. When the final cards hit the table, Caleb had a pair of kings. Garrett had tens. It was over. The saloon erupted. "Well, Stone," someone called, "you just won yourself the worst bargain in Montana." Caleb stood slowly. "The rope," he said. Garrett untied her wrists with rough fingers and stormed out with his remaining coins. The crowd lost interest quickly. The show was done. Caleb turned to the woman. She was looking at him now. Her eyes were dark, alert, not broken, not empty. "What's your name?" he asked. Silence. Then, softly, "Eleanor." "Eleanor," he repeated. "I'm Caleb Stone. I've got a homestead in the mountains. It's not much, but you'll be safe there. That's all I can promise." She searched his face like she was waiting for the trick. Finally, she nodded once. Caleb removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. They stepped out into the cold Montana night. Stars filled the sky. The mountain road waited ahead. He helped her onto his horse and climbed up behind her. As they rode toward his lonely cabin, laughter still echoing in his memory, Caleb wondered what he had just done. He had not meant to change his life that night. He had only meant to do the right thing. But when dawn broke the next morning and he looked out across his struggling land, he would find Eleanor kneeling in the frozen soil, her hands moving through the earth with a strange tenderness. And that was when everything would begin to change. When Caleb woke before sunrise, he expected silence. Instead, he saw her in the field. Eleanor was kneeling in the cold dirt, and her hands pressed deep into the soil as if she were listening to it breathe. Frost still clung to the ground. The air bit sharp against the skin, but she did not seem to notice. For a moment, Caleb thought she might be trying to run. Then he saw the focus on her face. Not fear, not confusion, understanding. He stepped outside quietly, boots crunching against the frozen earth. "Eleanor," he called gently. She looked up fast, almost guilty. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked." "For what?" She gestured to the field. "For touching your land." Caleb frowned. "It's just dirt." She shook her head slowly. "No, it's not." She scooped a handful and let it fall between her fingers. "Your soil is too alkaline. That's why the wheat fails. That's why the corn never makes it. But underneath," her eyes brightened. "Underneath, it's rich. It just needs help." Caleb stared at her. He had worked this land for 7 years. 7 years of back-breaking effort. 7 years of almost enough. "How do you know that?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. "My father was a botanist, Professor Edmund Hartwell. We traveled the territories studying soil and plant life. He taught me everything." Her voice changed as she spoke. It grew steady, strong. "Plants speak," she said softly. "You just have to know how to listen." Caleb felt something shift inside him. This was not a broken woman. This was not something worthless. This was knowledge wrapped in bruises. "Can you fix it?" he asked carefully. Eleanor looked across the rocky land, measuring it. "Yes," she said, "but you have to stop fighting it." That day, everything changed. But instead of straight rows carved by stubborn pride, Eleanor had him dig circular beds. She planted crops close together instead of spread apart. "Companion planting," she explained. "Some plants feed the soil. Others protect their neighbors. They're meant to grow together." She pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket. "Seeds. Dozens of them. My father collected these," she whispered. "Hardy strains. Rare varieties, built for harsh land. Caleb watched her press them into the earth like they were treasure. For the first time in years, hope felt real. Weeks passed. Green shoots pushed through soil that had refused him for 7 long seasons. Then more. Then more. The field that once mocked him began to bloom. Potatoes, thick and heavy. Beans climbing strong. Squash spreading wide across dark earth that now looked alive. Giant, when Caleb loaded his wagon and rode into town, the settlement went quiet. Men gathered around his produce in disbelief. "Stone, what did you do?" Caleb glanced at Eleanor, who stood quietly beside him. "She did," he said simply. Word spread fast. Settlers rode up the mountain asking questions, begging for advice. Eleanor never turned anyone away. She knelt beside strangers' gardens the same way she had knelt in Caleb's field that first morning. Teaching, explaining, sharing seeds. For the first time, Caleb's land did not feel like a graveyard. It felt like a beginning. But not everyone was pleased. Thomas Dalton had been watching. He saw the wagons lining up at Caleb's homestead, saw struggling farmers improving their land, saw influence shifting. And he did not like it. One evening, a rider brought news. "Dalton's asking about her," Mr. Polson said grimly, digging into her past, saying knowledge like hers shouldn't be wasted on a small farm. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not for sale." Polson shifted uncomfortably. "He's talking to the territorial judge, claiming the poker game might not have been legal." Eleanor's face went pale. "He wants control," she whispered. "He doesn't care about me. He cares about what I know." Caleb stepped closer to her. "You're not property," he said firmly. "You're my partner, and you're here because you chose to be." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "Then marry me." The words surprised them both. Caleb blinked. "What?" "If we're married," she continued, steady now. "He can't argue I'm being held illegally. I'll have protection. A legal standing." This was not romance under candlelight. This was survival. But Caleb did not hesitate. "Tonight," he said. They rode to Silver Creek under a sky full of cold stars. The justice of the peace married them in his parlor. No flowers, no celebration. Just vows spoken quietly between two people who needed each other more than they could admit. When Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Eleanor's hands trembled. Not from fear, from belonging. They rode back to the mountain as husband and wife. The next 2 months were the happiest Caleb had known since Sarah. They worked side by side, laughed together at stubborn goats and oversized carrots, shared meals at the small kitchen table. Trust grew. So did something deeper. Until one afternoon, riders appeared at the edge of town, a territorial judge, official papers, and Thomas Dalton standing beside him with a smile that held no warmth. Inside the settlement hall, Dalton presented documents, a bill of sale, claiming Eleanor had been sold to him before the poker game, claiming Caleb had won property that already belonged to another man. The room erupted. Eleanor's fingers tightened around Caleb's hand. "They're forged," she said clearly. "I was never his." Dalton spoke smoothly about contracts and transfers and legal ownership. Ownership. The word hung in the air like poison. Judge Blackwood frowned. "There will be a hearing," he said. 30 days from now, at the territorial capital." 30 days. To prove she was not property. To prove a powerful man was lying. To protect everything they had built. As they stepped outside into the fading light, Eleanor leaned into Caleb. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. That night at the poker table? Caleb looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, at the life she had brought back into his land and his heart. Not for a second, he said. Behind them, Thomas Dalton watched, and the smile on his face said this was far from over. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the co. 30 days passed like a slow-burning fuse. Caleb and Eleanor worked through fear the way they worked the land. Steady, focused, refusing to give up. By day, they tended the fields that had become the pride of the territory. By night, they gathered papers, wrote letters, and prepared for a fight neither of them had asked for. Thomas Dalton had money. He had influence. Well, he had men who would swear to anything for the right price. But Caleb and Eleanor had something he did not. They had truth. 2 weeks before the hearing, Caleb rode into town searching for proof that Dalton's papers were forged. Rumors swirled that the notary who signed the bill of sale had only arrived in the territory recently, that the ink used in Dalton's documents did not match the dates written on them. Caleb pushed deeper than he should have. One night, desperate and tired of waiting, he broke into Dalton's ranch office. He found files, dozens of them. Families pushed off land through forged contracts, mortgages rewritten without consent, signatures copied, lives stolen on paper. Dalton had built his empire on lies. Caleb managed to take photographs with a small, borrowed camera before Dalton's hired men caught him inside. The fight was brutal and fast, 3 against 1. He escaped through a shattered window, but not without cost. By dawn, he rode back to the mountain bleeding and barely holding the reins. Eleanor ran to him the moment she saw him sway in the saddle. He collapsed into her arms. "Got it," he whispered through broken breath. "Proof." She cleaned his wounds with steady hands, though her heart shook inside her chest. His ribs were cracked, his shoulder bruised deep purple. But he was alive, and they now had evidence. Dalton responded with intimidation. 6 armed riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the homestead. They did not approach. They did not speak. They simply watched. A message: "You are alone." But they were wrong. That evening, wagons rolled up the mountain road. Mrs. Henderson led the way, chin high, apron still dusted with flour. Behind her came farmers whose fields now thrived because of Eleanor's teaching. Men carrying rifles, women carrying food and blankets. "We protect our own," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. The homestead that had once been lonely became a fortress of community. 5 days before the hearing, the territorial marshal arrived. Not the local one Dalton had influence over, a federal marshal. He listened carefully, examined the photographs, brought in a handwriting expert. The conclusion was clear: forgery, fraud, systematic land theft. Dalton had underestimated the quiet mountain man, and he had underestimated the woman he called worthless. The day of the hearing arrived under a cold October sky. The settlement hall filled early. Tension hung thick in the air. Dalton entered confident, dressed in fine clothes, his expression smooth and controlled. Caleb and Eleanor stood together at the front, hands clasped. Judge Blackwood began the proceedings. Dalton spoke first, repeating his claims of legal ownership, of contract transfers, of rights violated. Then the marshal stood. He presented the photographic evidence, the handwriting inconsistencies, the paper stock that did not exist on the date claimed. One by one, Dalton's documents fell apart under scrutiny. Murmurs spread through the hall. Dalton's jaw tightened. Then, cornered and furious, he did something that destroyed him. He reached inside his coat. A pistol flashed in his hand. Gasps filled the room. His eyes locked onto Eleanor. "If I can't have it," he snarled, "no one will." The shot rang out like thunder. Caleb moved without thinking. He stepped in front of her. The bullet tore through his shoulder and he hit the floor hard. Screams echoed as deputies tackled Dalton to the ground. The pistol clattered across the wooden boards. For a moment, everything was chaos. Then, silence. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside Caleb, pressing her hands against the wound, her voice shaking, but steady. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Stay with me." The doctor arrived quickly. The bullet had passed clean through muscle. Painful, but not fatal. Dalton was dragged from the hall in chains, his empire crumbling around him. The judge rose, face pale and stern. "These documents are fraudulent," he declared. "The marriage of Caleb and Eleanor Stone is legal and valid. Mrs. Stone is a free citizen with full rights." The hall erupted in applause, not just for a marriage defended, but for justice restored. Over the following weeks, Dalton's crimes were uncovered in full. Lands were returned to families he had forced out. His ranch was seized. He was sentenced to prison for fraud and attempted murder. The powerful man who had tried to own knowledge, land, and people lost everything. Winter came. Snow covered the fields that had once been barren and now promised abundance. Caleb healed slowly. His shoulder would ache when storms rolled in, but he wore the scar with quiet pride. One spring morning, months later, Eleanor stood on the porch with her hand resting on her rounded belly. She was expecting. Caleb stood beside her and staring across fields already green with new growth. The catalog she completed over winter had been printed and shared across the territories. Settlers wrote letters thanking Professor Hartwell's daughter for knowledge that saved their land. The woman once wagered like property had become the most respected voice in frontier agriculture. Caleb looked at her and smiled. "They said you were worthless," he said softly. Eleanor leaned against him. "They were wrong." He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "They just couldn't see." Below them, the land stretched rich and alive. Seeds she planted had grown into more than crops. They had grown into community, into justice, into love. Inside her, their child kicked, eager for a world built on kindness instead of cruelty. Caleb had walked into that saloon believing his life was over. Instead, that night had been the beginning. Sometimes what the world calls worthless is simply misunderstood. And sometimes the greatest blessing comes disguised as a gamble. As the sun rose over the Montana mountains, Caleb wrapped his arm around Eleanor, and together they looked at the life they had built from nothing but dirt, courage, and the simple choice to do what was right. It was enough, more than enough. I'm really curious to know,